Hey everybody, this week's Torah portion is Parshas Chayei Sarah, and in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, the Torah tells us how Avraham decided to buy a piece of real estate in order to bury his wife. Now, he wanted a very specific piece of real estate, and that was what we call Ma'aras HaMachpelah, the cave where Adam and Eve were buried. He had a specific reason why he wanted that piece of land. And he ended up bargaining for a long time with the person who owned the land, a man named Ephraim, until finally he paid a very enormous price for that piece of land. Now, the Torah tells us, or actually really the Mishnah tells us, that Abraham had 10 huge tests in his life, going in order from smaller to greater. So the first test was the easiest he ever faced, and the last test was the hardest he ever faced. And virtually every single commentary on the Torah lists the fact that he had to offer his son as a sacrifice, or almost offer his son as a sacrifice, as the 10th test he faced, meaning that was the hardest thing he ever went through. The lone exception is Rabbeinu Yonah, the early commentary, who says that the fact that he had to offer his son as a sacrifice was actually the 9th test, but there was a harder test he had to face, and that was the fact that he had to pay for a piece of land that was in Israel when God had already told him that the land of Israel would be his. So the fact that he had to buy a piece of land to bury his wife in when God had already told him that this land would be yours was considered a bigger test of his faith than being told you have to offer your son as a sacrifice. Now, how can that possibly be? How can it be that the fact that he has to pay for land that he was promised would be his could be harder than all the other things he did in his life? We have to remember, he was told by God to go to Israel. He gets there and there's a famine, so it looked like God didn't keep his word and told him to go somewhere for no reason. He had to leave there and go to Egypt and have his wife taken away from him for a period of time. He was thrown into a furnace he almost died being thrown into a furnace because of his monotheistic beliefs. He had a lot of hard tests in his life. The biggest deal in his life is that he had to pay money for land that he was already owned. Listen, if he got through everything else, this is cheesecake compared to the other things he's been through. Why is this considered the biggest test in his life? And our rabbis say a very important principle, and that is as follows. Every other test Abraham had been through, all he had to do was wait and see why it was the best thing for him. So, for example, when he was told to sacrifice his son as an offering, if once he waited and did everything he was supposed to, he found out that he was never going to actually kill his son to begin with. And when he was told to go to Israel, which ended up being a famine resulting in him going down to Egypt, when he waited and said to himself, "Let me see what God's plan is," he saw that ended up making him very wealthy. And so on and so forth, through every single test he faced, he ended up in his lifetime seeing why that was the best thing for him. There was just one exception. That was when he was told, you're going to get the land, and then had to pay for a spot for his wife to be buried in. Because the why to that was never answered. He never found out why the best thing for him was to be told he was going to get a piece of land and not get it. And that is the hardest test we ourselves have to sometimes face in life, when we see something that doesn't make any sense to us, and we ask why, but we never get the answer. Because the most difficult test to a person's faith is being able to know that God knows what's best, but at the same time never finding out why it's the best. And that's why that was considered on some level to be the hardest thing Abraham had to ever go through. All the more so when we in our lives, who don't have obviously the faith or the level of faith that Abraham had, have to see things or go through experiences which are very hard for us to understand. The biggest test to our faith often comes when we don't know the why, but we have to know that it's ultimately for our benefit. On behalf of Makarvi, Shabbat Shalom.